Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to the Founders Playbook from Lab to Launch. Because let's be honest, the typical startup advice doesn't work for deep tech founders. You can't just move fast and break things when your product has been developed over a decade of peer-reviewed research. You can't just follow the Silicon Valley playbook when you're navigating intellectual property with a university and trying to find capital for hard tech in a capital-constrained world. So where do you get the real answers? You get it from somebody who's actually doing it. And our guest today is Jason Norman, founder of FlexiSense. He's lived through the entire lab to launch journey, developing technology, searching for the first believer, and living through the challenge of turning complex research into a product that someone will actually pay for. So today we're just going to get the unfiltered truth about the mistakes made, the lessons learned, and the strategies that have actually worked. So if you're an academic thinking of making the leap, this is a conversation you've been waiting for. Jason, how are you doing? Nice to have you on.
Yeah, not bad. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Where are you talking to us from today?
So up in Edinburgh, which is where I live most of the time.
Beautiful part of the world. So I'm going to dive straight in if I can, because as you're now the founder of FlexiSense, but before that, or even while you're doing that, you've also been a researcher. Tell us about that core scientific or technical problem that you were obsessed with in the lab.
So maybe my journey's a little bit different in that. So I finished sort of my PhD just about 2 years ago, but it was actually in a totally different area I'm working on with FlexiSense. So I was actually working on liquid crystal lasers, looking at how we could use this technology to sense things about the real world, whether that's in medical applications or environmental monitoring. And I think the through line with that is I was at the very other end of research and commercial. From the commercial end, I was super early, blue sky research. No one's done it before. 5 people in the world probably care about it, sort of thing. I loved using technology to solve problems, but I found in my PhD perhaps I was a little bit too far from the solving real problems aspect of that. It was a bit of an opportunistic leap. But basically, my PhD supervisor had been working on this pressure sensing technology that underpins FlexiSense. And he's been doing that for the last decade. The university had been paying patent costs for them and were kind of getting on his back a bit about commercializing it, and he had no one to commercialize it. So I sort of was in the right room at the right time, basically, when that conversation was being had, and sort of grabbed it with both hands.
Nice. So knowing the people that are doing some interesting things and being in the right room at the right time always helps. So imagine you're explaining your company and what you do to someone who isn't an expert. In simple terms, what is the problem you're solving?
The main problem we're solving is in wound care. The NHS is spending something like a couple of £1 billion on wound care every year. And it's interesting because it's up there with diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease in terms of the scale of spend. Yet it's rarely talked about because it doesn't kill you directly, right? But it does ruin your life. And so there's billions of pounds being spent. And as usual, there's sort of a minority of patients causing probably 90% of the spend. That's patients with chronic wounds. So people who are going in to a clinic or seeing a nurse week in, week out, and not getting any better. And I've met patients, it's heartbreaking in a way that, and you can imagine how frustrating it is. They've had this condition for years. I mean, sometimes even a decade or more, and just made zero progress. And that's really what FlexiSense is aimed at. How can we get these people who can't heal and are suffering and are miserable and get them healing quick so they can get on with their lives and get back to work and stop being in pain. The area we're targeting, which is one of the sort of biggest causes of chronic wounds, is venous leg ulcers. Sort of the only real gold standard of treatment is compression therapy. Basically, you wrap a bandage around the lower leg where the ulcer is, and it squeezes the leg, and it helps get the blood back up. But the problem with that is at the moment, compression therapy is done purely by feel. So it's kind of guesswork. But the thing is, there is a right dose of compression to heal people. Too much compression, you can actually cause injury. You can even lose a foot if it's really bad. Too little, which seems to happen in most cases. And this is where you get your chronic wounds. You're treating it, but it's actually, we've developed basically a really low-cost wearable pressure sensor that can go underneath these compression garments. And it gives that feedback of what doses of compression is the patient receiving, is it the correct one, and how that's evolving over time. And the idea is we're not doing anything fancy, right? There's loads of wound care startups that are doing plasma therapy stuff with sort of Star Wars like lasers, all that kind of thing. We're just saying, can we just get the basics right and have a big impact that way, rather than doing sort of £1,000 treatments that look cool but aren't necessarily the best way forwards.
So hold on. So for kickoff, you're saying that the NHS spends £2 billion a year on this problem.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge. That's absolutely huge. But I guess because it's just a little bit by little bit by little bit, you don't see that big number until you start to collate it together and aggregate it.
It's because if in terms of a singular treatment, something like a bandage, it's probably costs £5 to £10 to the NHS. But it's actually the nurse coming in twice a week, spending an hour with the patient having to then be booked into patient transport to take them to the hospital. That's where it turns into billions.
Right.
Yeah.
And the use of all those clinicians' time and all that stuff that you don't see because it's not specifically attached to that wound care. It's just generic lots of nurses, for example, if you like. It's not visible in the accounts in that way.
It does get broken down by, you do sort of get, they're called tissue viability nurses. So you do get specialists, yeah. But there's just not enough of them. They're totally overstretched.
So that's interesting as well. So you've got specialists, but there's not enough of them. So I guess that also means that quite often someone doesn't get what you're talking about, which is the right level of complexity.
Yeah. And then the one thing that comes up again and again is there's also not enough training available. So it's compression therapy. It's not difficult, but it is a trained skill. So they usually don't let patients do it themselves. And people who haven't been trained, so you say your sort of GP practice nurses, most of the time they don't really recognize the value of it or really understand it. So again, they tend to either not do it at all or not use it well. And you see people in some real states as a result. There was a guy who was a patient came into a clinic I was shadowing, and again, he'd had his leg ulcer for most of 10 years on and off, and it was like the bane of his life. And he'd just given up treatment for years. He'd literally been just wrapping it in kitchen towel, which you can imagine the risks that carries. And he finally found the right person who immediately saw him, understood what was going on, and he was getting better. So within months, it was so unnecessary. The rest of that decade of suffering. And again, because he goes to his GP and they just don't necessarily know what to do with it or who to send him to.
So, and those stories of like a decade, or even if it's like a few years or something, that's just so disabling in so many ways. And you can't work properly. There's so many things it would take your life out. So stories like that make you sit up and really think about this sort of debilitating thing that you just normally wouldn't see. But then the other thing that you said was, look, we're not going to do a Star Wars thing here. There are other projects knocking around that I think you mentioned lasers or something, much more technically complex than what you're doing. But it sounds like you've gone for something that is, well, again, it's the NHS if you start with there. So it's got to be something that's fits in their system, is affordable, I guess, as well.
Yeah, and I guess we're a bit unusual in that we're not offering a new therapy. We're almost a quality assurance of what's already being done. Yeah, I think the price point is, especially in the UK, is very important. Billions is being spent on treating these chronic wounds. But if you think about the products involved, bandages, stocking, until you get into those complicated therapies, your max price point is probably £100 to £200. So you can't come in and say, we've got a solution, it's great, but it costs £1,000, which is what a lot of startups try and do. And actually what's really interesting is, one thing I'm grappling with at the moment is, and it's big for us, is health economics. So the argument lots of startups in this space make is, so they spend £3,000 a patient and they say, well, we reduced the healing time on average by a third. So therefore we're saving you £1,000 per patient. Therefore we're going to charge you £700 for the therapy. And then it's just like immediately, especially in the UK, they can't stretch or have the budget for that.
Well, I guess because also then otherwise what you're having to do to find that money is go to different budgets like transport and nursing and all sorts, which they don't have access to because it's another budget line.
Yeah, and it's almost impossible to find one person who sits above all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. So that cash just isn't available to the people you're talking to. Okay, all right. So look, you've got people, particularly with venous leg ulcers, and the problem you're solving is that some of them just don't heal, and they can go on for a year, 2 years, even up to 10 years. So you mentioned the meeting that you were in when you were talking about compression technologies. When you started working on that, what was the point where you thought this really does have something that we could do to make a commercial product with? This is something we can actually make work.
So I guess I explored lots of different areas. So actually, one of the best things I did at the get-go was the iCure program, where I sort of got a really whopping big sort of £35,000 travel budget for 3 months to go and speak to as many people in as many different sectors as possible. So things like robotics, tactile robotics, AR, medical devices, R&D, that sort of thing. And we did find interest in certain areas, particularly in actually R&D. So we spoke to a few kind of quite big sportswear brands and kind of performance wear brands who are really interested in measuring how their clothing, their products interact with the skin, and they're super interested. And that was kind of our initial target. But then you very quickly run the maths and realize there's maybe like 50 to 100 firms in the world that are doing R&D at that level, and they're not going to buy it week in, week out from you. And so that actually, even though we had people who loved it, that actually kind of killed that idea a bit for us. I think it was when I was sort of trying to think about potential applications, obviously one of the things I did was have a look at what our competitors were doing. And there's a lot of our competitors who do on-skin pressure essentially produce sort of really expensive systems, so £10,000 systems that are really used for very specialist research applications. But interestingly, there's this company in Ireland that had started looking at compression therapy with their ones. But that's when I kind of went down a rabbit hole of I'll go and attend a few sort of wounds care conferences and nursing symposiums. And there, as soon as I got to the first one, you just realize the scale of the problem. They're talking about billions. They're talking about how just impossible their jobs are at the moment. This wasn't even me poking them about it. This was just what they were talking about with each other, which usually indicates that it's at the front of their minds and it's quite an important problem to solve. And so then I went and spoke to some of the best clinicians in the UK in compression therapy, and sort of actually went asked to go into their clinics, actually sit there, watch what they do, see what sort of pain points they have. And I actually have to say that is the one amazing thing about the NHS. I emailed, so there was someone called Alison Bryden up at Dundee Hospital, one of the largest teaching hospitals in Europe. And I emailed her one day, and then she just replied, "Oh yeah, just pop in this Wednesday," and just walked in. No bureaucracy whatsoever. These clinicians are so approachable and so happy to have you in there looking at their work.
I mean, there's a culture thing there, isn't there? Because people are there there's not competition in the NHS. There is something about it being very much part of the community. People talk about it as being the UK's only religion. And it's a very, very, whenever you go into the NHS, they're just very, very normal people. And there's like more than 1 million of them working in the place. So it's, as you say, it's a nice culture to go and walk into and talk to.
And even if they don't like the sound of your idea or what you're working on, they're still more than happy to kind of indulge you as well. So it's great. Which is also, in a way, speaking to the clinicians who are very skeptical about what you're doing is more valuable than speaking to the ones who love your idea from the get-go.
Yeah, because that's what you learn, right? That's when you learn, that's when you get the proper feedback so you can improve it. And you've just been talking a lot about that. I mean, iCure program, a lot of people have mentioned on this podcast, but then also going to those conferences. How did you heard people talking about some of the issues they've got, and they were talking to each other about it. But I'm assuming you weren't going around and eavesdropping, because
No, yeah.
So how did you do that? How did you find out stuff from people in these conferences?
There's a certain aspect of just having to go for it and approach people. I'm naturally quite introverted, and the first thing they want you to do is go to a conference and just, I mean, their whole thing is have 100 conversations. You turn up and you don't know anyone, you're like, what right do I have talking to anyone here? And I remember the first one I went to was a orthopedics conference which is totally outside my area of knowledge, in Leipzig. And I remember for the first kind of hour of the day, I was just walking around a trade hall, and I just could not bring myself to speak to anyone. I was so nervous, and I had to call up my wife for a bit of moral support and courage. And then I think I had the perfect first conversation because I got speaking to a guy who produced these sort of liners for prosthetic legs. As soon as I spoke to him, introduced myself, turns out he was the CEO. He was super friendly, interested in what I was doing. You just got to be bold and just speak to many people, except probably half the people I talk to just sometimes like hostile even, but most of the time indifferent. And actually, the more you do that, you just get used to it and it becomes less scary. I think in terms of getting information from people, I think you've ChangeSchool covered this very well, but it is that one test. It's actually, I just ask them about themselves. I don't mention what I'm doing pretty much whatsoever because people love talking about themselves. I only really mention what I'm doing and asking if they're interested in it at the very end of any conversation or even as a follow up, because I think as soon as people think they're being sold to, they're out. They don't care. So.
Yeah, so it's true. So it's a bit of just diving in and getting used to it and having someone on your other end of the phone line, if you can, just to help you out, because it's an emotional process as you get used to it, right? And not many people, very few people just do it naturally. Some people do.
Yeah, some do.
But not many. It's very much a minority. So it's about getting used to. Then you also mentioned there are techniques that you can use as well. It's not just a random conversation, right? The mum's test is a very famous one. The things you can use. And then that also helps, I guess, because then you know what the questions are already in your head. You haven't got to worry about what you're going to say.
Yeah. And sometimes I've had really valuable conversations at these events with people who I weren't necessarily targeting. So very early on in IQ, I was going to a few sort of animal health events to basically look at wound care, but in animals rather than humans. And I got chatting to a guy. He had a technology that did some sort of like DNA analysis or chemical analysis. I can't remember what it was. It was totally not the sort of person I was planning to speak to. I was just walking past and I saw their machine. I was just generally interested. I wasn't even trying to get anything out of it. And I just got chatting to that guy. Was friendly, and then it turns out he knew 5 people who were quite established in wound care, and sort of put me in touch with them. So sometimes actually also, I don't know what advice that comes out from that, but sometimes you get really useful input from people you're not expecting. So I guess that's spread your web as wide as possible.
Yeah, you never know. So what was the tipping point that made you decide, look, I'm maybe even going to leave what is an only relative safety of academia and want to start a company?
The point at which I had reasonable confidence, I think the first time we sort of attracted leading clinicians as potential collaborators. So as soon as you had people, really big names, fairly big names in the UK, who are happy to slap their name on grant applications with us, happy to do collaborative research with us. And I think the other half is there's a certain bit of bloody mindedness.
Validation and bloody mindedness. I think it's a very good combination.
But yeah, I was always looking for that kind of golden validation where they want to buy it now, right this second. And I think what clinicians, that kind of path is a bit more cautious and they tend not to adopt new things until there's been tons of clinical validation, tons of proof. And so actually the point you need to get to there is quite high, which is challenging for a spin out because it's like, well, realistically, that's going to take us, if we do really well, another 2 years. So what do we do until then? How do we attract investors? That sort of thing. And there we have been looking at, I mentioned earlier, some of those kind of sportswear and performance wear. So really interested in R&D applications and looking whether, because they were very much now, would really be interested if you had it right now for sale, would buy it. We're potentially looking at as a gap filler and as a kind of an insurance choice, really.
So that's interesting as well, because as many entrepreneurs do, what you're thinking is that, particularly with medical devices, it's a very, very long-term thing. It takes ages to get it done. The regulations, let's be honest, we're quite happy that our doctors are a little bit risk averse. It's not a bad thing, but and so therefore you've got another application that's running alongside, and then you can generate cash with it, hopefully, while you're doing it. So it's a good strategy.
But it sounds intuitive to most people, but sometimes when we've not been pitching, but had kind of friendly conversations with investors, a fairly decent majority actually hate the idea of focusing on two things. A lot of people see it as a distraction, and they'd almost rather you took a bit longer and got to what you actually.
Yeah, that's interesting because you've got to then work out which investor is right for you and which wants you to do what you want to do as opposed to what they want to do, which is always an interesting conversation. Well, let's dive into that for a minute. Let's hit the investment question. So you're having conversations with investors. How have you, I mean, we've talked about the fact that it's going to be a long-term thing for the medical devices. How have you funded the company thus far?
So at the moment, just grants. So enterprise fellowship, which is amazing because it's 12 months and you're quite free with what you can do with that. So that's been sort of a godsend. IKIL brought in some money and also we're on the Scottish Enterprise High Growth Spin-out Program. The sort of next step towards clinical development is probably more grant funding as well, unfortunately, just because we are just a little bit too early. So just as clinicians want to see clinical evidence, investors ideally want to see that clinical evidence too most of the time before it's sort of de-risked enough for them. So that's probably a next phase as well.
So at the moment you're still in that grants phase, but you've had
Yeah.
conversations with investors. So what else? What have you learned about that, both in terms of what they've told you and in terms of the process? What's it like?
So sometimes you see software startups and sometimes you post for companies who've just joined Y Combinator, for example, and they've just basically got an idea and some software and already getting investment, or barely even have the product. I think speak to investors in healthcare, they almost have to have that clinical evidence or at least be at the point of generating it. We have a great idea, we can do the health economics, we can make a great case for the impact we could have, but I think the bar's maybe a bit further than that. The more I've spoken to people in this area and other people who may be a few years ahead of me with their companies, is actually that it's a lot softer than that. You don't stand in a room for 10 minutes pitch and get a yes or no answer. Actually, it is more of a back and forth. And actually, in a way, the point of having these conversations now is to get a name on the radar. And actually, a bit like the mum test, I'm not coming to them being like, right, I want investment in my sensor company. I just talk to them about them, get a feel for what sort of things they're interested in, kind of build it up that way.
But that's an important thing because
Yeah.
you're saying you're early. You're not going out right now saying I need money, but what you are doing, learning what they think, learning how they think, building a relationship with them, and getting to know them a bit so that when the time comes, you're a lot more ready than someone that's just appeared out of the blue.
Yeah.
Oh, important to do. Okay, so coming back, so you're at the moment you're grant funded, and that's fine. And it sounds like you think you're going to be able to keep that going until such time as you are able to de-risk enough to get
Yeah.
investment. Who was the first person outside of the group you were working with that sort of said to you? You said a moment ago there were people that were happy to put their names on your grant applications, for example. All of a sudden, that was the validation piece. Who was the first, like, true believer, if you like, the one that said, "Look, come on, yeah, you can do this"?
So I think in first as true believer was this guy who runs a mid-sized compression wear firm in Germany. His whole brand is that they produced bespoke compression garments because they recognized that actually a lot of the mass market stuff just isn't working and isn't delivering what's required to heal these people or at least help them manage their conditions. And so I guess he was the first true believer because as soon as I mentioned what I did, his eyes lit up and we had sort of a 45-minute long conversation just there and then at his sort of trade show stand. And he's had follow-ups wanting to do field trials. And normally it's me asking them for that. But, when you've got someone emailing you because they're excited and they start listing the potential your product has over the next 5 years for you without you doing that to them, that's a great feeling. So I guess that's maybe the first, yeah, that's probably the first person I spoke to and thought, wow, someone actually cares. Yeah.
Nice. Oh,
Yeah.
nice. Yeah, that enthusiasm from somebody.
Yeah.
Great feeling. So it's hard tech. It's pressure sensors. It's bandages. It's all this sort of stuff. What's the biggest sort of technical hurdle that you've had to overcome to get this into a viable product?
I guess I managed to skip a lot of the hard work because I joined after they'd already done 10 years of research. Something we're overcoming at the moment is getting something that is very robust for these customer trials and clinical trials. We need something that the clinician could just take and use without much training.
So it's getting it usable in the real world, which
Yeah.
is very messy place, particularly in
Yeah.
hospitals and different patients and different people. So it's the real world messiness
Yeah.
that's the challenge. Talk about intellectual property for a minute. So you're still at the university. The guy's been working on it for 10 years. When you spin out, there's that whole conversation to be had with the university about intellectual property, the whole conversation with any investor to be had about intellectual property, because they're going to want to make sure that you've got it. You either own it or worse, lease it. Like, how are you going to deal with that? Patent? Is it just know-how and trade secrets? What approaches are you going to use?
So we already have a patent in place for the process we use to make these really flexible pressure sensors and super thin, super flexible, biocompatible. And there's all sorts of things in there that's already being patented or it's been granted in with the US and China is pending, UK, Europe. That's been the first route because things can progress so rapidly. You can actually outgrow your own IP quite quickly. So I think one of the things we're being really careful with at the moment and we're spending a lot of time on is IP strategy. So actually getting, not necessarily putting patents in place now, but getting them ready and speaking to our patent attorneys and trying to get a feel for what would be the best way to protect it going forwards. Because I think our biggest challenge at the moment is we're protecting the fabrication process. But as we go through to putting up patients and trying it out, that's really, we need to kind of protect that application piece as well. There's a lot of sort of know-how as well, especially in sort of this research clean room setting. It's amazing how you could give the same run sheet to say two different people and they can actually, one could do it really well and one could mess up. And there's sometimes like things people do that are, they don't necessarily realize they do or unspoken. That's sort of the secret ingredient.
Interesting. So getting those applications right and getting that process right. And then protecting that as IP as well. How did you end up getting your prototype built? Now, I'm going to be slightly specific if I can on language here, because when you hear the term minimum viable products, people hear it in different ways. From someone who's commercial, that means the first thing that somebody can use in the market. From somebody who's prototyping or an engineer, that means something that works.
Yeah.
Which is a bit different. I mean, as you've just said, real world messy is different from working in the lab. Creating that, so the prototype, it sounds like you've got in that you've created it in the lab. And I guess that was grant funded. Was that just developed inside the university?
Yeah.
And then as you're building this one to deal with the mess of the world, again, is that going to be you doing that with the people that have already done the research? How are you getting people to cooperate with that because it's in a clinical environment? How are you making that happen?
So we've got a lot of support, and it's been great from an organisation called the Medical Device Manufacturing Centre, who are based around a few universities in Scotland, and they provided so much free advice and help on how you validate things for the clinicians, what's the regulatory pathway like, what do we need to prove to get it to then get it to the point where it can be tested on patients. Medical device regulations are so hard to understand. I feel like the more I learn about them, the less I know, sort of thing. Taking the engineers and the researchers out of the lab and putting them in front of the people who actually do the job. One of my business advisors is well connected with sort of mass, sort of super high volume flexible electronics manufacturing. So we're actually speaking to someone at the moment who's sort of doing a bit of a scoping of potential ways to scale up the manufacturing of this device. Because of the medical device regulation, if there's a difference between how we build it in a clean room and how we build it when we're building a million of them, that's actually really important because the regulatory pathway is so involved. It's something you want to kind of know quite ahead of time.
So that's another thing that you've got to get sorted out. And it's often something that's overlooked. People think, oh, they're creating this technology, it's wonderful, but actually the particularly hard tech, you've got to make the thing. Very different from software. You've actually got to make it. And as you say, with medical devices, well, hold on, it's got to be made in a way that is okay with the regulations. It gets packaged properly. It's whatever, I don't even know the right words, aseptic, antiseptic, whatever it is, kept clean so that it can be used in the hospital.
I mean, I've met people who've developed sort of a whole product line, gone to launch it, and then there's sort of been very one minor error on literally the box the device is in, what's printed on it, and they had to scrap the whole lot. The problem is you get told by people who sell you regulatory consultancy. They're the ones who tell you this, but they always say it's best to spend more now than to try and sort of do it on the cheap and have to redo it later.
It sounds like you're building a lot of partnerships around that, as you were just saying. So there's people that create medical devices. How have you built those partnerships?
I think in Scotland, the ecosystem is really great here. The Medical Device Manufacturing Centre, you've got people like Tay Health Tech, so they're based up in NHS Tayside up by Dundee, and they're the ones who say, if you ever need any help or need to speak to anyone or need any clinical input, just send us an email and they get you through to the right person within the hour. It's 6 million people. It feels small enough that actually everyone knows everyone's in a way. So it's actually quite easy to get those introductions.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, and those networks are vital, aren't they, to get those partnerships? Getting an introduction is a real shortcut, a massive shortcut. Okay, so you've got a prototype, you're talking to manufacturers, you've been to talk to people at conferences, talk to clinicians. You've spoken to medical device manufacturers in Scotland, but also in Germany. You've done the I course. You've spoken to lots of different companies. So all of a sudden, you're sat in the middle of this really quite broad network through that work. How did you identify your first potential customer?
From just being in a room with them. There's a difference between someone who's like, oh yeah, it's quite interesting, tell me more, to someone whose eyes light up and then they spend the hour telling you how great it is.
Yeah. Normal stuff is the early adopter stuff.
Yeah, pull versus push a bit.
Yeah. You've said that you're working with a team. You've said that these guys have been out for 10 years. So how's it working? Are you working there as a co-founder? How many are there? How many people you got working with you right now?
So I see myself as a solo operation at the moment, because in terms of who's working full time on it and who's sort of primarily focusing on it, it's me, ported by the two academics who co-invented technology sort of about 10 years ago, provide advice and input as and when needed. I get really great support from the tech transfer team. And the primary person working at the moment is my business advisor, John Gilhooley, who's also based up here in Scotland. He's sort of been helping make a lot of introductions, and he's also been doing a lot of work for us in Asia and Singapore and China. He's almost acted as a mentor more than a colleague, so we have quite really good conversations. We challenge each other. Sometimes it feels like through sort of that relationship, sort of having that kind of devil's advocate has been really important in terms of really challenging the idea. And also, I think our job as well is to just try and kill the idea as hard as possible. Almost like doing our best to prove it's terrible, never going to work.
Because if you can do that, then and it won't die, then you think, well, maybe this will work. Yeah. So there was a whole gamut of stuff there, because there's the guys that have been doing the developments. There's technical support. There's the guys that the person who says commercial, which you got that level of advice. The TTO being helpful and useful. So there's that level of advice, and I guess that's also a lot to do with the legals and the IP and stuff like that. Is that sort of their level of expertise as well? So you built around you a bit of a network of all the different types of advice and support that you might need.
Yeah. We're imminently trying to hire someone in a technical role. As I've gone more down the commercial route, I'm trying to get this MVP done. Has been quite challenging without having someone who's sort of dedicated to it. Yeah.
It's exciting.
Yeah.
First hire. Very exciting. Cool. Okay, so let's look back across that whole lab to launch bit to where you are, all the way from being in that meeting where all of a sudden somebody sort of suggested that maybe you want to take something on, all the way to you've done the grants, you've done the ICOR, you've spoken to companies in Germany, you've spoken to companies in Scotland, you've built a network, you've got advisors, building that capability. Is there anything that you'd change if you could go back and do it again?
Putting even just a dummy version of a technology in people's hands much earlier on, getting them actually holding, it doesn't really matter whether it works or not. Just getting them holding something actually gets them a lot more excited, and they start coming up with ideas. You don't say anything to them and they start telling you how it's used. So I think getting that done earlier, times when it's going great and you think ever you're going to be a billionaire in the next week, and other times where it's like absolute crap, you want to quit. I think being really honest with the rest of the team, 90% of the time you can just pull the band-aid off and people won't mind. In fact, they tend to prefer it.
And interesting, that thing about giving people something in their hands and they start to tell you, it's a different thing from looking at a screen or something. And again, because it's hard tech, right? So it's something physical, it's real. They're going to use it in the real world. Nurses and doctors are real world people that use that all the time.
So my business advisors in Singapore at this kind of gathering of health tech companies from the UK looking for investment. And they go around the table and everyone was sort of, oh yeah, interesting, great idea. But one guy literally bought a 3D printed box and it looked just like a box. But because it was a box, everyone was like, ooh, wow, very. So, and then as soon as we saw that, we were like, well.
Yeah, gets you the attention. That makes sense. It's hard tech, it's medical, it takes years. Is there anything that makes you do it differently because it's hard, because it's medical, because you're in Scotland, because you're in the UK?
Two things. I think first, there was a whole industry built up around spin outs, and it happens a lot around ICO actually, especially as you get so much advice from people who've never done it, and it's intuitive and it sounds great, and they love to talk about it, post about it, LinkedIn, whatever, and actually it's just not valuable and can kind of sometimes send you down the wrong avenue. With advice, are they trying to sell you something? Have they done it? Are they actually experienced? I think factoring that in heavily before deciding whether you're going to take it on board or not is very important, because we have been sent down the wrong avenue because someone said something that sounded right and wasn't, and we could have nipped that in the bud earlier. And then the other, there's almost like a default setting. We're looking for VC investment, we're a subscription, we're something as a service. There's kind of just default. And actually, I speak to a company and they said, oh yeah, you buy our product and we give it to you. It was like amazing to hear. So I think, and again, speaking to a few VCs, I think being aware that just because everyone else is following that a certain model doesn't necessarily mean it's right for you. We might still be looking at VC money in the future, but one of the best conversations I had was VC, and it wasn't because they said it wasn't appropriate for us, but they were just saying they see so many companies who are just shooting for VC money, promising sort of 10 times returns every year, whatever it is. And they said actually for a lot of hard tech spin outs that they don't necessarily need that. Really think fundamentally about what you need. Don't just see what everyone else is doing and follow it.
Yeah. Well, that's almost the sum up of both those, isn't it? Don't follow the fashion. Don't follow just what people say. Do your own thinking. Do your own thinking. Really interesting. Is there any tool or anything or technique you've learned, or anything that you would say this is worth a read, that if someone is thinking about starting, is there anything you'd say, well, look, first thing you do, fella, try this. Have a look at this.
I was one of those people who, throughout my PhD, I'd go to lots of talks about entrepreneurship, talks by spin-out founders. I'd even go to round tables and listen to what they were saying. And I'd always have this feeling, oh, that's so interesting. I'd love to do that sort of thing, but I'm not an entrepreneur. I just don't have that skill set or whatever. And I think the key switch for me was you're never going to feel ready, or you might never feel like an entrepreneur. So what I tend to do is sort of jump and then worry about how I'm going to do it afterwards. I get nervous about presentations, but I just agree to do them and then worry about doing it when it comes up, sort of thing, because that's the only way forwards for me. And then in terms of content, what has been actually helpful is just reading the Financial Times and listening to something called a Prof G podcast done by a guy who was sort of professor of marketing at New York University, and just by getting exposure to kind of day-to-day business news, that does sort of seep in. You start to learn the language and you start to get a feel for strategy and what people are doing.
Something about keeping in touch with the world around you, seeing what's going on, because the strategy side of it is you've got to know what's happening, got to have some of that.
Yeah, and you start thinking about it on a deeper level. So say after going through sort of the ChangeSchool training with you, I might see an article and it'll be about, I don't know, an insurance company or that's done some, it's acquired someone or taken some sort of strategic decision. And whereas before insurance, whatever, now it's sort of actually, I start thinking on a deep level, well, why have they done that? What's caused them to do it? What's the impact of that? And it's almost easier to think about that sort of thing for other people than yourself. Yeah. So that's been helpful.
And I love the fact that you've just said, look, just got to jump in, just got to do it. I think that's probably the most important piece of entrepreneurial advice anybody can ever get. Just get on with it, give it a go. You'll dive in, make the commitment. Because you've made the commitment, you'll get it done.
Yeah. Well, that's why I'm on this journey in the first place. I was in that room and I said yes. I'm worried about whether I actually had the competency to do it later on. So,
yeah, just jump in. Love it. Really important. Now let's start to look ahead. So what's the most exciting milestone for FlexiSense in maybe the next 12 months?
Getting that prototype ready and getting it into field trials. People being hands-on with the technology is just, that tells you way more than 100 conversations can. And actually getting clinicians testing it. These are going to be sort of super early, kind of healthy volunteer type testing, ideally within the next 6 months. I think that's a key point we need to reach before spinning out.
So getting that out, making sure it works as you need it to work in the environment in which you need it to work.
Oh, actually, the previous question, I thought of another bit of advice. So there's so many plates I'm spinning. Like there's, technical, commercial, regulatory, manufacturing, whatever. I find most of the time I really deep down I feel and know what is the one thing I actually need to be doing next. And actually over the last 12 months, I think rather than try and do everything, especially at the stage I'm at, in your gut what the one thing you need to do is, and just focus relentlessly on that, even if it slows down the other things. Yeah. And hence why we're really focusing on these field trials at the moment, and I'm kind of actually leaving a lot of the other commercial work to the business advisor, because I know that that's the one thing that's going to make a difference, and so I should just spend all my time and energy on that.
Knowing what to focus on, knowing where to go,
and ideally just one thing,
just one thing, get it done. Get
Yeah.
one thing done, then get the next thing done, but get it done.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's good. So you're about to start field trials. It's a stage that you need to do to get it right before you think about spinning out. That's all quite a critical stage. So for anybody listening, whether it be potential partners, maybe future investors, people who want to be involved in the journey, what are the challenges that you've got now where our audience could help you?
So I guess where we really not would like support with and could get quite complex is knowing exactly where it is you need to get to reach that kind of inflection point and spin out and start looking at investment. Because you could speak to some people and they like, well, we need full on, double blind clinical trials done and dusted. Whereas others are like, actually, you only need to have shown it works on 5 healthy volunteers. And that's enough. So I think if there's anyone familiar with sort of the medical device field and it has a good sense of actually what is the bare minimum you need to do, and how, again, stop us spinning our wheels and trying to do too much. Just, having a sort of really hone down what is it we need exactly and no more. And for future employees, that's really awesome, is you get so much exposure to so many different people, and I think you get to influence and think on a level that if you were going through a conventional job, you wouldn't get there for, you probably wouldn't get that experience in 5 or 10 years in some cases. So I think that's what's to offer, is you learn so much very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That is the journey of an entrepreneur, isn't it? You're learning all the time. You're being exposed all the time.
Yeah.
Which makes it fun.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Makes it fun. So finally then, where can our listeners go to follow you, follow your journey, and learn more about what's happening at FlexiSense?
So hopefully stay tuned. We'll have a website and all that nice stuff soon enough.
Lovely stuff. And how do they get in touch with you? What's the best way?
Probably email jason.norman@ed.ac.uk.
Jason.norman at ed.ac.uk. ed.ac.uk. And all of those details will be in the show notes. Jason, thank you so much for coming along today. Lovely to talk
Thank
to
you.
Really interesting because it's different to most of these things. It's medical, it's earlier stage. You're working through a certain stage of the process. Some lovely bits of advice knocking around there as well. Really nice. Thank you very much for coming along.
Great, thank you. That's been great.
Jason Norman, ladies and gentlemen, founder of FlexiSense.